Most people think a tired heart needs more time, more answers, or some grand turning point to feel whole again. But sometimes, strangely enough, what it needs is permission to stop trying so hard. There's a quiet kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't touch, the kind carried behind polite smiles and steady routines. If you've ever felt like you're functioning on the outside while something inside has gone dim, you're not alone. This story begins exactly there, in that hidden space where strength has quietly turned into weariness. It follows someone who did everything right, endured more than most, and still felt an unexplainable emptiness growing inside. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a soft fading of warmth that made ordinary days feel heavier than they should. Along the way, he discovered something unexpected. Hearts don't heal by being pushed forward, but by being allowed to rest. What he found wasn't a technique or a miracle, just a simple truth most of us were never taught to notice. And once he saw it, the path back to wholeness didn't feel impossible anymore, only unfamiliar. So if part of you has been quietly asking whether it's too late to feel like yourself again, stay for a while. You may recognize pieces of your own story in his, even the parts you rarely speak about. There's a gentle lesson waiting here, one that doesn't demand anything from you, except a moment of honesty. By the end, you might realize that what you've been searching for hasn't been lost at all. It has simply been waiting for you to come back and sit beside it, the way one returns to an old friend. He often woke before the alarm, not because he was rested, but because his heart had learned the habit of bracing for another day. There was a quiet ache in him, the kind that didn't announce itself, just hummed beneath everything like a distant engine. Friends would say he seemed steady, dependable, even calm, and he'd nod with a polite smile that felt carefully folded. Yet in the small spaces between tasks, he wondered when simply being alive had started to feel so heavy. It was as if he had been carrying something for years and could no longer remember when he'd first picked it up. At work he listened, solved problems, reassured others, all while a soft fatigue pooled behind his ribs. He laughed at the right moments, said, "It's nothing," when asked if he was tired, and kept moving. People admired his strength, which would have been flattering if it didn't feel so lonely. Sometimes he caught his reflection in a dark window and barely recognized the dimness in his own eyes. Still, he straightened his shoulders, the way people do when they hope posture might substitute for peace. Evenings were the hardest, when the noise of the day drained away and left him alone with the echo of his thoughts. He would sit at the edge of the bed, unsure whether he needed sleep or something gentler he couldn't name. There had been disappointments, of course, sharp words, doors quietly closed, hopes that never quite bloomed. None of them had broken him outright. They had simply settled, layer upon layer, like dust no one notices accumulating. And now he feared that whatever part of him once felt light might be permanently buried underneath. On particularly quiet nights, he placed a hand over his chest as if checking whether something inside was still there. His heartbeat answered, steady but tired, like a traveler who had walked too far without rest. He wondered, not dramatically, but with sincere curiosity, whether a heart could forget how to feel whole. The question lingered in the room long after the lights were off, softer than fear, but heavier than doubt. Somewhere deep down, he suspected the answer mattered more than anything he had been pretending to manage. One morning, while searching for a misplaced document, he noticed an old object tucked behind a drawer, something cracked, worn, and strangely familiar. He didn't remember putting it there, yet the sight of it stirred an unexpected tenderness in his chest. For a moment he simply held it, unsure why his throat tightened or why he suddenly wanted to sit down. It felt less like finding an object and more like being quietly recognized by something that knew his story. And without quite deciding to, he sank into the nearest chair, as if that small discovery had opened a door he wasn't sure he was ready to walk through. He turned the cracked object over in his hands, noticing how it seemed lighter than it should have been, as if time had been slowly emptying it. There was a faint line along its side where something had once tried to hold and couldn't anymore. Oddly, he didn't feel the urge to fix it, only to sit there with it resting in his palms. The morning light slipped across the surface, patient and unhurried, as though it understood something he didn't. For the first time in a while, he didn't rush to stand up. A quiet thought surfaced. Maybe not everything worn down needed to be pushed back into shape. He had spent years enduring, tightening, carrying, believing that strength meant never setting anything down. But the object felt different, almost as if it were asking for stillness instead of repair. He leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly, surprised at how unfamiliar that simple act felt. It occurred to him that rest wasn't the absence of effort, but a kind of care he had never learned to offer himself. Memories flickered in small, uninvited flashes, moments when he had ignored his own limits to keep others comfortable. He saw how each time he had said, "I'm fine," something inside had quietly stepped further back. No wonder his heart felt distant now. It had been waiting for permission to stop performing. He traced the crack with his thumb, not to assess the damage, just to acknowledge it was there. The gesture felt strangely respectful, like greeting an old part of himself he'd neglected. The room was silent except for the soft rhythm of his breathing, slow and tentative at first. He tried an experiment, closing his eyes for a few seconds and letting his shoulders drop. Nothing dramatic happened, yet a small pocket of space opened inside him, like a window unlatched after years. It wasn't relief exactly, more like the absence of pressure, and that alone felt precious. He wondered if healing might begin not with effort, but with allowing that space to exist. When he finally stood, he didn't hide the object away again. He set it gently on the table where light could reach it. Something about that choice felt quietly significant, though he couldn't have explained why. He sensed that acknowledging his weariness hadn't weakened him. It had made something honest possible. As he prepared to leave the room, he paused, glancing back as if expecting the object to say something more. And in that pause, he had the faint, unmistakable feeling that the day might unfold differently than all the ones before. By the time he stepped outside, the world had already begun its usual hurry, and he slipped into it like someone putting on a familiar coat. Neighbors greeted him, and he answered kindly, his voice steady in that practiced way that revealed nothing. From a distance, he looked like a man who had his life in order, someone who could be relied on without question. Inside, though, there was a hollowness that echoed whenever the noise around him faded. He carried it quietly, the way people carry aches they've learned no one else can see. At the office, he listened patiently to complaints, offered solutions, even comforted a colleague on the verge of tears. He knew exactly what to say. He had become fluent in reassurance while remaining a stranger to his own needs. When criticism came his way, sharp, careless, tossed without thought, he absorbed it with a nod. Later, alone, the words replayed in his mind with a weight far greater than they deserved. It wasn't the comment itself that hurt, but how easily it found the tender places already there. During lunch, he sat on a bench, unwrapping a meal he barely tasted, watching people pass with purposeful steps. He wondered when he had last felt genuine anticipation about anything at all. There had been a time when small things, sunlight on a wall, a kind message, the smell of rain, felt like quiet gifts. Now they brushed past him unnoticed, as if his senses had grown tired too. He caught himself longing, not for excitement, but simply to feel warmth again. That evening, back home, he noticed the cracked object waiting on the table, exactly where he had left it. For reasons he couldn't explain, seeing it there softened something in his chest. He picked it up and sat on the floor this time, leaning against the couch like someone who had finally stopped pretending to be composed. "I used to feel more than this," he murmured, half expecting the empty room to disagree. The admission didn't fix anything, but it felt like opening a window in a house long sealed. He stayed there longer than planned, turning the object slowly, remembering fragments of who he had been before the disappointments piled up. There had been hope once, quiet, steady, nothing flashy, just a belief that life could be kind. He realized he missed that version of himself more than any lost opportunity or broken plan. A faint ache rose in his throat, not sharp enough to become tears, just enough to remind him he wasn't numb after all. And as dusk settled around him, he sensed that this quiet confrontation with his emptiness was only the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. The object, he finally realized, was a small clay vessel, no bigger than two hands cupped together. A thin crack ran from its rim down toward the base, like a quiet lightning strike frozen in time. When he tilted it, a faint powder of dried clay slipped free, as though it had been slowly shedding itself for years. He couldn't remember where it had come from, only that it felt oddly personal, almost companion-like. It sat in his palms with the fragile dignity of something that had endured more than it was meant to. He filled it with water at the sink, curious, half hoping it might still hold something without leaking. At first it did, and he felt an unexpected flicker of satisfaction, the kind that comes from small mercies. Then, a single drop appeared along the crack, trembling before falling into the basin below. Another followed, then another, until the vessel wept steadily despite his careful grip. He watched in silence, recognizing the quiet futility of trying to contain what insisted on escaping. For a moment he considered sealing it, patching it, doing something practical to stop the loss. Instead, he lowered it gently onto the counter and let the water drain at its own unhurried pace. There was something honest about the way it released what it could no longer carry. He leaned against the sink, oddly moved, as if witnessing a private confession he hadn't meant to overhear. It occurred to him that exhaustion sometimes looks exactly like this. Not dramatic, just unable to hold more. Afterward, he dried the vessel carefully, tracing the crack again, this time with a kind of reluctant tenderness. The flaw no longer seemed like damage. It looked more like a story written in clay. He imagined all the invisible pressures that must have shaped it. Heat, time, strain no one had witnessed. In a quiet way, it felt less broken than honest, as if it had stopped pretending to be intact. He set it by the window where the fading light touched the fracture and made it glow faintly. That night he kept glancing toward it, half expecting it to teach him something simply by being there. The room felt different, softer, as though acknowledging fragility had changed the air itself. He wondered what it might mean to treat his own heart with the same gentle acceptance. The question lingered, patient and unresolved, like a door waiting to be opened from the other side. And somewhere beyond that quiet wondering, footsteps were already moving toward him, though he had no idea yet who they belonged to. A few days later, he carried the small vessel with him on a walk, unsure why he felt reluctant to leave it behind. The afternoon was unhurried, the kind that made even the city seem to speak in softer tones. He wandered into a modest courtyard he had passed 100 times without noticing. An elderly woman sat there feeding birds, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. When she looked up and saw the vessel in his hands, her eyes warmed with quiet recognition. "May I?" she asked gently, not reaching for it until he nodded. She held it as though it were something alive, turning it slightly so the light traced the crack. Most people would have commented on the damage, suggested glue or replacement, something brisk and practical. Instead, she smiled, not with pity, but with a kind of respect that surprised him. "It has been carrying more than it was made for," she said softly, as if speaking about an old friend. He found himself sitting beside her, telling fragments of his story without meaning to. She didn't interrupt or rush him along, only listened with the steady presence of someone who wasn't afraid of silence. When he faltered, she simply nodded, as though the pauses mattered as much as the words. At one point she wrapped the vessel loosely in her scarf, not to hide the crack, just to cradle it. The gesture felt so careful it made his chest ache in a way that wasn't entirely painful. "Broken things aren't in a hurry," she said after a while, her voice carrying the calm certainty of lived experience. "They don't need to be pushed back into usefulness right away." She placed the wrapped vessel back in his hands, guiding them as if reminding him how to hold something gently. For a moment he noticed his breathing had slowed to match the rhythm of her voice. It struck him that this was the first time in years he hadn't felt expected to be strong. They sat together without speaking, watching the birds hop and scatter in the golden light. He became aware of a quiet steadiness settling inside him, subtle but unmistakable. The woman seemed in no rush to explain anything, as though trust had to grow in silence first. When he finally glanced at her, she was studying the vessel again with a thoughtful expression. And the way she held that silence made him sense she was about to share something that would change how he understood both the object and himself. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created an ebook called The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours and More Too Bonus for you. It's for those who want to let go, set boundaries, and live with more lightness. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. The woman brushed a thumb lightly over the vessel's crack, not to test it, just to acknowledge it was there. "Most people think healing means becoming as you were before," she said, her voice almost blending with the wind. "But sometimes it means learning you were never meant to carry everything alone." He listened, unsure why those words landed so deeply, as if they had been waiting for him specifically. She loosened the scarf slightly, allowing the vessel to breathe in the open air again. "Notice how it doesn't resist," she continued, tilting it so a line of sunlight settled into the fracture. It stopped striving to be perfect, and now it simply rests in what it is. He realized how foreign that idea felt. resting without earning it first. For years, rest had been something postponed, conditional, always after one more effort. The possibility that it could come before anything else unsettled him in the gentlest way. She placed the vessel on the ground between them, steady and unprotected. "Leave it here for a moment," she suggested, as though proposing a quiet experiment. He hesitated, then set his hands on his knees, unsure what he was supposed to feel. At first there was only awkwardness, the reflex to reach back and pick it up again. Then, slowly, a faint easing moved through his chest, like a knot loosening without being pulled. "Your heart is like that," she said, nodding toward the vessel. "It heals when you stop clutching it as if the world will take it from you." He hadn't realized how tightly he had been holding himself together until that instant. A long breath escaped him, deeper than he intended, carrying something unspoken with it. The release felt unfamiliar, almost undeserved, yet undeniably real. She wrapped the scarf around the vessel once more, not to conceal the crack, but to keep it warm. "Kindness is the beginning," she murmured, placing it back in his hands with deliberate care. He held it differently now, not as something fragile he had to protect, but as something allowed to rest. The courtyard seemed quieter, as if the world itself had softened to make space for this moment. And as he looked at her, he sensed there was still more to learn, not through effort, but through the small, unfamiliar practice of gentleness she had just placed in his care. In the days that followed, he began waking a little earlier, not from tension this time, but from a quiet curiosity about the morning. He would sit by the window with the vessel in his hands, saying nothing, doing nothing, just breathing. At first it felt unproductive, almost indulgent, like skipping a step everyone else seemed to take. Then he noticed how the light slowly filled the room, as if the day were arriving gently rather than rushing in. Something inside him started to match that pace, hesitant but willing. He tried small experiments the woman had hinted at without calling them instructions. When a sharp email arrived, he paused, placed a hand over his chest, and took one slow breath before replying. The world didn't collapse because he waited a minute. In fact, the tension dissolved like mist. He even allowed himself a quiet smile, surprised at how little it took to interrupt the old spiral. It felt like discovering a hidden switch no one had mentioned before. Evenings changed too, though subtly enough that no one else would have noticed. Instead of replaying the day's disappointments, he would set the vessel on the table and watch its shadow stretch. Sometimes he whispered a single sentence into the quiet, something simple like, "That was enough for today." The words felt awkward at first, like trying on clothes that didn't quite fit yet. But over time they settled around him with a warmth that felt strangely familiar. He began to notice small pockets of joy returning, shy and easily startled. The smell of coffee in the morning, a stranger holding a door open, a breeze moving through leaves. None of it was dramatic, yet it touched him in a place that had been numb for years. He found himself lingering in those moments, letting them soak in instead of brushing past. It was as if his heart, given permission to rest, was remembering how to feel again. One afternoon he realized he hadn't thought of himself as broken in several days. The vessel still had its crack, unchanged, quietly honest on the shelf. Yet it no longer looked like a symbol of loss. It looked like something that had survived. He reached out and held it, not because he needed reassurance, but because he wanted to share the calm he was beginning to trust. And as he stood there, he sensed life preparing to test this newfound steadiness in a way that would once have overwhelmed him. The test came sooner than he expected, on an ordinary afternoon that began like any other. A familiar voice on the phone carried disappointment sharpened into blame, the kind that used to unravel him. He felt the old reflex rise, the urge to apologize for things that were never his to carry. His chest tightened, breath shortening, the past reaching forward as if nothing had changed. Then his gaze fell on the vessel resting quietly on the table beside him. Without making a show of it, he placed his free hand over his heart, just as he had practiced. He let one slow breath in, then another, as if creating a small shelter inside himself. The other person kept talking, but the words no longer pierced as deeply as before. For the first time, he noticed the space between what was said and what he chose to hold. It was small, fragile, but unmistakably his. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, not defensive, not withdrawn. He answered with care, but without surrendering himself to the storm on the other end. The conversation ended without resolution, yet he didn't feel hollow or ashamed afterward. Instead, there was a quiet steadiness, like standing upright after years of leaning. He realized that protecting his energy didn't require hardness, only balance. Later, walking home, he expected the usual exhaustion to crash over him. It didn't come, or at least not with the same heaviness. He even noticed the sky, streaked with the soft colors of evening, as if the world were acknowledging his effort. A faint sense of pride surfaced, not loud or triumphant, just warm and steady. He had stayed present without abandoning himself, and that felt new. Back inside, he lifted the vessel and held it near the window, watching the fading light gather in the crack. It no longer looked like something that might shatter at any moment. It looked like something that could hold what mattered and release what didn't. He set it down gently, aware that this quiet strength would need tending, not forcing. And as the room settled into dusk, he found himself wondering how many other hearts might be waiting to learn the same gentle skill. That night, as the room grew still, he sat with the vessel resting against his chest, feeling its cool surface through his shirt. The quiet felt inviting rather than heavy, like a pause that didn't need to be filled. He remembered the woman's voice, not as words exactly, more as a feeling of being gently guided. Almost without thinking, he placed his hand over the vessel and took a slow, steady breath. The air moved deeper than usual, as if it had been waiting for permission to. He closed his eyes and searched his memory for a moment that had once felt safe. It took a while. The mind, unused to tenderness, wandered at first. Then he recalled a simple afternoon from years ago, sunlight on a wall, laughter that asked nothing of him. The memory arrived quietly, but it warmed him from the inside, like a small lantern being lit. He stayed with it, breathing slowly, letting the warmth spread without analyzing it. When doubt crept in, the familiar whisper that this was pointless, he didn't argue with it. He just noticed it, the way one notices a passing cloud without chasing it across the sky. Another breath, steady and unhurried, softened the tension gathering in his shoulders. He realized this wasn't about fixing anything. It was about allowing space for what was already gentle. Even a minute felt like enough to shift something subtle but real. He imagined others sitting somewhere in their own quiet corners, hands over tired hearts, unsure if it would help. The thought made him smile softly, a sense of shared humanity easing the last traces of loneliness. No one had taught him this simple kindness toward himself. He had stumbled into it by accident. Yet it felt like something ancient, obvious once remembered. The vessel rested in his hands as if approving of this new ritual. When he opened his eyes, the room looked the same, yet he felt slightly more present within it. He set the vessel down carefully, as though placing a bookmark in a story still unfolding. There was no dramatic revelation, only a quiet sense that he had touched something true. He wondered how different his life might feel if he returned to this small practice again and again. And as that thought settled, a deeper understanding began to form, one that would soon reshape how he saw wholeness itself. In the weeks that followed, people began to notice a softness in him that hadn't been there before. Not weakness, not distance, just a quiet ease, like someone who had stopped arguing with the tide. He still faced disappointments, sharp words, lonely evenings, all the ordinary trials of being human, but they no longer defined the shape of his days or the weight of his heart. Something steady had returned, not newly built, but rediscovered. One morning he filled the vessel with water again, curious whether anything had changed. A few drops still escaped through the crack, tracing the same fragile path as before. This time he didn't rush to save the water or feel discouraged by the loss. He simply watched the sunlight catch each falling drop, turning it briefly into something luminous. It struck him that even what leaks away can be part of a quiet kind of beauty. He carried the vessel to the courtyard, half hoping to see the woman again. She wasn't there, yet the place felt welcoming, as if her presence had settled into the air. He placed the vessel on the bench and sat beside it, breathing in the gentle stillness. For the first time, he understood that wholeness wasn't about becoming unbroken. It was about allowing life to flow through the cracks, without losing the capacity to hold love. As he prepared to leave, he hesitated, then left the vessel behind on the bench. Not as abandonment, but as a quiet offering to anyone who might need the reminder. His hands felt strangely light, free in a way that didn't frighten him anymore. He walked away without looking back, trusting that what he had learned would remain within him. The morning air carried a sense of completion so subtle it almost felt like a secret. And somewhere, perhaps in another quiet room, another weary heart would stumble upon that small, cracked vessel. They might not understand immediately why it made them pause or breathe a little deeper, but something in its silent presence would whisper that rest is not surrender, that wholeness is less a destination than a gentle return to what has always lived inside. And the story would begin again, unfolding wherever someone finally allowed their heart to be held instead of driven.